유난히도 화창했던 지난 8월의 어느 날, 한국외국어대학교에 많은 학생들이 모여들었는데요. 이들의 목표는 오직 하나. 바로 고등학생 영어토론대회 최강자에 도전하는 것입니다. 횟수로 7년째를 맞은 이 대회는 학생들의 뜨거운 관심에 힘입어 6년 전에는 중학생 대회를, 올해는 초등학생 대회를 신설해 그 입지를 넓혀가고 있습니다. 보통의 쓰고 말하는 수준의 대회들과는 달리 한 주제를 놓고 찬반의 논리로 맞붙게 되는 영어 토론 대회. 국제적으로 역사가 깊은 영국식 의회 토론 방식을 따서 만들어졌는데요. 찬성팀은 수상, 부수상, 여당 원내 총무로 구성된 정부 측 역할을 맡아 찬성 의견을, 반대팀은 야당 대표, 부대표, 야당 원내 총무로 구성된 야당 측 역할을 맡아 반대 의견을 제시하게 됩니다. 참가 방식부터 규정까지 어느 하나 예사로워 보이지 않는데요. 주어진 즉흥 주제를 놓고 정부 혹은 야당의 입장에서 논리적으로 우위를 점한 팀이 심판에게 더 높은 점수를 받게 됩니다. 총 42개 팀 중에서 치열한 예선을 거친 16팀만이 본선에 진출했습니다. 토너먼트 방식으로 진행된 이 대회에서 2일간 무려 8경기를 거쳐야 결승에 진출할 수 있는데요. 만만치 않은 본선에서 화죽지세로 결승전까지 올라온 단 2팀. 누군지 궁금하시죠? 지금 바로 만나볼까요? 결승을 앞두고 토론 준비에 한창인 이들은 독특한 팀명의 빠빠샤, 야당 측을 맡았네요.
저희가 팀 이름을 빠빠샤라고 지었는데요. 이게 러시아에서 총 이름이거든요.
네? 총이라고요?
Get out of the house, there's a bomb!
우리가 생각하는 이 총 맞는 거죠?
근데 그게 2차 대전 때 되게 잘 사용됐다고 제 밀리터리 덕후 친구가 알려줬거든요. 그래서 제가 항상 총 이름을 팀 이름으로 하고 싶었는데
왜 총 이름을 하고 싶었어요?
뭐라 해야 되지? 되게 파괴력 있잖아요.
That is the fundamental concession that came from government whip, that if you don't have jobs, government should fund that. Humanities, under her logic, is not gaining much support in terms of...
맹렬한 기세의 토론을 기대해도 좋다는 뜻인 거죠? 한편 상대 팀과는 달리 차분한 분위기의 이들은 정부 측을 맡은 동갑내기 팀 For the Win.
저희가 같이 일단 연습을 하는데 많은 시간을 보내잖아요. 근데 계속 연습을 되게 열심히 하고 나서 YTN 대회 전 마지막 연습 끝나고 같이 치킨을 먹으러 갔는데 원래 사람은 먹으면서 친해진다라고 말을 하잖아요. 그래서 같이 치킨 먹으면서 우리는 그냥 팀 동료뿐이 아니라 같은 학교를 다니는 정말 사이가 돈독한 친구들이구나라는 거를 다시 느낄 수 있었어요.
아하, 치느님이 맺어준 운명의 팁이란 말이죠. 치킨 결의의 힘으로 결승까지 오다니 정말 대단합니다. 오랫동안 쌓아온 끈끈한 팀워크로 승부한다. For the Win 팀의 염정호, 장한별, 성희연. 학년도 다르고 개성도 다르지만 실력으로 똘똘 뭉쳤다. 빠빠샤 팀의 박재환, 문지환, 박지윤. 6인 6색의 친구들이 토론의 정수를 뽐낼 오늘의 결승 주제. 결승 주제인 만큼 어렵진 않을까요?
아주 재밌는 주제인 것 같아요.
찬성치에 걸리면 어렵겠다.
되게 반가웠어요.
친숙하지만 생각할수록 생각할 거리가 많이 나오는 모션인 것 같아요.
오늘의 주제는 바로 이공계 교육을 인문계 교육보다 중시해야 한다입니다. 이공계냐 인문계냐 한창 진로 고민이 많을 고등학생들의 관심사를 제대로 저격한 주제네요. 토론 주제를 받자마자 부지런히 준비를 시작한 찬성팀 첫 번째 주자 민족사관고등학교 2학년 염정호 학생. 오래도록 바라던 결승에 진출해 감회가 남다르다는데요.
저는 중학교 때 YTN을 나왔었는데 그때는 그렇게 잘하지 못했어요. 그때 막 결승에 진출하는 팀들 되게 멋있어 보이더라고요. 그래서 저도 언젠가는 한번 서보고 싶다?
정부 측 수상역을 맡은 정호 학생. 이공계 교육을 우대해야 한다는 정책을 가지고 야당 측과 심판들을 설득해야 하는 임무를 띠고 나왔습니다. 정부 수상역은 첫 주자인 만큼 토론의 성패를 좌우하는 매우 중요한 역할이죠.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. When government says that it's quite unfair to say that STEM education has absolutely more value than humanities, because we consist to the fact that both of the educations in terms of STEM education and humanities are necessary, or something that good to the society as a whole. But when it comes to the government's duty, and when it comes especially to prioritizing between the segments of the education in between STEM education and humanity, we say that STEM education inherently necessitates more funding, more support by the government. So 3 things bigly on the proposition today why the STEM education must be prioritized. First of all, about how the STEM education gives a tangible effect, a solutions to your life. Secondly, how the STEM educations need more monetary investment in terms of their characteristics and the qualities. And thirdly, how prioritizing and then implementing today's policy definitely brings a more and future social benefits in terms of longer aspects. So with that said, let us directly move on to our first cases, which is about how the STEM education in general brings a much more tangible benefits and solutions to your life. So Mr. Speaker, intuitively, let's look back to the history. It was the Gutenberg printing press in which that gave an access to the public to have an access to the information, in which it actually enlightened the benighted public in the first place. And we say that it was a transportation technology which have enabled us to access to the opposite side of the earth, which have made the earth as a whole. And we say that it was the internet which have allowed to change the world, which changed the way you're living. And we say that all the technologies and the unique benefits that we derive with the STEM education is something that have directly used, increased the social utility as well as changed and enriched your quality of life. No, thank you, sir. So let's think about the direct benefits, the characteristics of the STEM education. First off, we say that the STEM education brings you a direct benefit. It increases social utility and gives you an economic benefit. Because what you learn from this knowledge, like the equations on the physics, you directly apply that knowledge that you learn from the STEM education to the real life that brings a tangible result in our society. That's why lots of students who encounter the physical courses apply their knowledge, apply their equations to the real life, and makes this technology, makes Wi-Fi technology and the internet. And by the technology and engineering, we say they make a medicines, a cure which saved the millions of people's lives. But that doesn't really necessarily happen in the humanity education. Why so? Because, Mr. Speaker, the inherent qualities or the characteristics of the humanity education is most of all fundamental question into your life. It's about like retrospecting your personal life, or whether or not it's philosophy or your literary things. But that maybe increase your intellectual ability, that maybe increase your depth of thinking, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the practical use that benefits the whole society. And the second characteristics of the STEM education is that it is actually the prerequisite for the humanities to take place. It is actually a prerequisite, a before step that you must have in order for the humanities to maximize its own full potential. Thank you, ma'am. We say that in most cases in which the social unrest happens, or the civil unrest happens, is in which the case when your basic or adequate amounts of the resources are not met. And we'd like to introduce you the idea of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which basically tells you that when your fundamental needs like food or shelter is not kept, then you cannot proceed over the secondary rights, you cannot proceed on to the humanities, ladies and gentlemen. That is why in case of the war, the most fundamental reason why the countries wage war between each other is because of lack of resources, is because of short of something they necessarily get to act. And in case of when the revolution have usually taken place when looking back to the history, we say that there was when most of the cases when the citizens felt that their quality of life has not been guaranteed by the government. And in all these cases, we say by promoting STEM education and by giving you a tangible result, by manufacturing goods and foods and shelter that you directly need in the very first place, it actually solves the shortage of the resources that we have in the first place, and it also gives you food. It actually creates a space, and it actually brings you up on the upper level in which you can have time and you can have your own life to think upon and move up into humanity. And thank you. Now, this effectively moves on to our second argumentation about the characteristics of the STEM education. Why does it necessarily necessitate more monetary funding? Let's think about the characteristics of the humanity, Mr. Speaker. We say that the characteristics of humanity is something that is dealing with the best teachers for the advanced humanity education. Like something like famous philosophers, writers, or debaters of the time, or in history. We say that with the advent of the internet that we already have another status quo, and with lots of ebooks and wealth and information and the materials that we already have right now at this moment, we say we can easily access to this kind of information by comparatively cheap way or often free way. But you can just digging up and delving into the internet. You can possibly find lots of books and materials that was written by the John Rawls, and you could possibly dive onto his argument or theory of the justice. You can also delve into the Schopenhauer's theory of how to be a great debater when you just look at the Wikipedia, or when you look at and delve into the Google. But this possibility is why the science necessitates them more money on this house. Why? Because keeping a technology in recent sciences labs necessitates a lot of money. For example, in even high school and definitely in university level, you cannot really process a simple experience because you do not have a necessary microscope in your laboratory, because you do not have necessary chemicals in your laboratory. And considering the fact that those kind of microscopes and chemicals necessitate money in the first place for the educational institution themselves to buy and purchase and to keep and maintain them, let us start a third point, that furthermore we put to the Mr. Speaker, that we need to investigate more money onto this kind of STEM education to solve the imbalance that we're having at the current status quo. By investing more money and creating more future paths and giving more money to the people in terms of pure science and pure mathematics, we can actually incentivize people like really scientific prodigy to stop going to the medical schools or stop really uselessly, wasting their human resources, and we can adequately reallocate human resources into the necessary situation that will definitely bring us a much more benefit as well. So for all those reasons, you must propose for the propositions. Thank you.
정부 수상력의 정우 학생은 이공계가 실질적인 사회적 가치와 이윤을 창출한다는 점에서 투자할 이유가 명확하다고 주장했습니다. 또한 이공계 교육의 특성상 많은 물적 자원이 필요한 점도 투자의 이유가 된다고 꼽았네요. 네, 정우 학생의 말을 들으니 이공계 교육에 투자해야 한다는 정부 측의 정책이 확실히 납득이 가는걸요. 이렇게 탄탄한 정부 수상의 논리를 반박할 야당 측 다음 주자는 바로 민족사관 고등학교 3학년 박재환 학생. 아니, 재환 학생은 앞서 연설한 정우 학생의 같은 학교 선배였네요. 후배의 뛰어난 연설을 들은 뒤에도 재환 학생은 평정심을 유지, 좋은 기량을 보여줄 수 있을까요?
되게 안 흥분해요. 되게 놀랍기도 한데 차분하고 웃으면서 잘 얘기하는데 그게 제가 보기에는 첫 번째 스피커랑 제일 잘 맞는 것 같아요.
네, 야당 측 대표 역을 맡은 재환 학생은 정부 측 수상이 기선을 제압한 토론장에서 침착하게 야당의 논리를 대변해야 하는데요. 이미 정부 측에 빼앗긴 심판들의 마음을 다시 훔쳐와야 하는 쉽지 않은 일을 해내야 하는 만큼 야당 대표에게는 일관된 논리와 뛰어난 토론 실력이 요구됩니다.
Mr. Madam Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the audience, if education teaches you how to live your life, we think that humanities does have an inherent value, that it asks you what the meaning of your life is, that it asks you what your place in society is, it asks you what it means to live. But the problem with the current humanities education is that so much of that is crowded out by memorizing concepts, by memorizing history. We think, and we would welcome on our side of the house, the creation of a society that expands upon those humanities, which is a society that this side fundamentally stops from happening. That's the critical harm that we're going to bring you in this debate. That's the basis upon which we're going to debate this motion. We think there are enough institutions, like KAIST, for instance, that specialize in this sort of education, but there are also corporations who are currently buying out educational institutions because they realize that sort of supply is going to be filled out. We think there are currently enough actors outside of the state that can support this sort of education if it does need more facilities. But we think that the government acting in this situation is very, very different to those corporations, to those private sector, to those private sectors, because it is sending a strong message out into society. We don't necessarily recognize humanities as something worth funding anymore. We think that's the sort of message that side is sending. But we would also question exactly who out of the people that are planning to go to the sciences field they are dealing with in this debate. We think that the science prodigies that they're talking about already have scholarships, already are in those institutions. The question is, when you talk about the people who have benefits and capabilities in both, what they do on their side of the house is limit the self-actualization of those people. They're saying that these people are better suited to acting in sciences and humanities, which is a value judgment fundamentally that we don't think that they are justified in making. But we also think that the role of education was ignored on their side of the house. Their logic is that education of this sort brings a direct economic benefit. But we think that the role of public education goes much further than that. They tell you that the humanities can happen within the internet, can happen with the proliferation of information. Ladies and gentlemen, where in YouTube do you see a course in the humanities that is taught by a Yale University professor, for example? Where is the quality of that education? Where is that sort of proliferation? But finally, we'd say that we would ask the question of whether that sort of technological breakthrough, that sort of innovation on their side of the house is really happening. I've already analyzed for you previously how science prodigies aren't really the target of this policy. But we would also look at the structure of the Korean economy, which doesn't necessarily innovate in the status quo, but follows after the products of other nations. We think in order to solve this problem, fundamental problem, lack of innovation, you need to ask the question of what does progress mean in society? And that is a question that is exclusively answered by the humanities. And that's why we think that proposition's case today was deeply problematic. But the final thing we would tell you is about happiness and life, which we think is crucial because we live in a society in which those questions aren't asked enough. And we would welcome a society that asks those questions more. So first of all, let's look at the value of humanities. We think that the humanities is valuable. First of all, because it reflects human achievement, because it allows you to say, this is why progress is valuable. This is why this particular breakthrough is important. It allows you to place a value on the way that individuals act in their own society, in their own environment. We would give you the example, Mr. and Madam Speaker, of Rachel Carson, who writes about the problems of DDT, a new technology at the time, and because Rachel Carson criticized that technology, and it was we think through the humanities, through the questions that are posed by the humanities, that she was able to ask those questions to criticize society. But we would also say that the humanities is valuable as a way of political discourse within economies, because many of the humanities, like literature, like philosophy, are reactions to social incidents and phenomena. Secondly, we think that these questions get better and better when you analyze deeper and deeper. And we would say on our side of the house that that sort of education is not provided in the status quo. In history, you learn about the value of Korean history and events in Korean history. But you don't necessarily ask those questions. You don't necessarily assess the value of events happening within history for yourself. That is the problem of the current humanities education. But what they would do on their side of the house is they would limit the courses that people can take in that direction. They would limit the ways in which people think about those questions, which we think is fundamentally problematic. But finally, we'd say that it allows the placement of individuals within their own lives. It allows you to ask the question of what is life? What does it mean for you to live in a society? The problem here is that we live in a society in which people are constantly desensitized to those questions. But we would say on our side of the house that asking those questions more leads to a happier society, leads to ultimately a more productive society, as I'm going to explain in the second argument. But if you wanted to talk about realistic development, we would say on our side of the house that the equality of the two actually contributes to a better society on our side of the house. Because, for example, the CBRE Corporation released a statistic that said that 50% of jobs will disappear in 10 years due to automation. We think in that sort of society, management is more important, communication is more important, thinking about the values of things is more important, and we think that those things together lead to a better society as a whole. At the end of the day, that is the value of the humanities, and side proposition destroys us from feeling those values. Thank you.
야당 대표에게 재원 학생은 이윤에 따라 학문에 투자를 달리한다면 그것은 곧 공공교육의 역할을 저버리는 것이라고 주장했는데요. 이는 정부 측 수상의 말을 정면으로 반박한 것입니다. 또한 인문학으로부터 배울 수 있는 질문의 힘이 사회의 진보와 혁신을 만들어왔다고 주장했습니다. 어쩜 이렇게 토시 하나 틀리지 않고 옳은 소리만 할 수 있죠? 도저히 반박이 어려울 것 같은 상황에서도 찬성팀의 다음 주자는 돌파구를 만들어야 합니다. 정부 측 부수상역을 맡은 민족사관 고등학교 2학년 장한별 학생.
뭐 전에 이런 영어 토론에 대한 경험이 있어요?
중학교 무슨?
전 중학교 때 토론을 몇 번 했었어요.
근데
YTN 우승할 거예요. 뭘 입으로 말해요? 괜찮아.
부끄러움이 많아 보이는 한별 학생이 과연 야당 대표의 발언을 제대로 반박해낼 수 있을지 걱정되는데요. 정부 측 부수상 역을 맡은 한별 학생은 야당 대표의 연설을 반박하는 동시에 정부 측의 논리를 다시 보강해야 하는데요. 한별 학생, 이렇게 숙기가 없어서야 토론을 잘 해낼 수 있겠어요?
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we made it clear from the very beginning that neither team right now wants to give up either STEM or either the humanities. But the question that the government team placed you is that what kind of role does education play in promoting STEM and promoting humanities? If we can take $1 out, the $1 that we invest into humanities, and put that dollar into STEM education, because humanities in essence is not something that we personally think is important, that can be benefited more by providing more and more budget, by providing more and more money into centralized education, but rather on the other hand, because of the innate characteristics of STEM, that due to the advancement of technology, due to the advancement of science, we need more and more equipment, we need more and more money put into the STEM education in order for students to be up to date, in order for students to catch up with all the kind of new innovations that are being made. In that sort of situation, what is more beneficial? Team government says that it is more beneficial to pass this motion because we think that taking $1 out of the humanities is not going to be a huge loss, since the innate characteristics of humanities itself suggests that it's not centralized education. It's not putting a lot of money into the humanities that fosters proper humanities education, which we will delve on later into our third argument. But on the other hand, when it comes to STEM, because you actually do need a lot of physical material, because you actually need equipment, because you need chemicals in order to conduct experiments, in order to keep students continually engaged instead of just listening to bland lectures, we think that in that sort of case, it is necessary and it is proper for us to decide to prioritize STEM education, to finance STEM education more than we do in the humanities. So we think that actually many countries need much more investment in this area, and just saying that there is education right now does not mean we need to prioritize it more, because in that case there is already a lot of humanities education as well. And also, they said that another problem is that South Korea does not innovate, and they somehow said that the humanities is going to help South Korean companies innovate. We didn't see a clear link there, and we rather think it's much more realistic to say, no, it's actually science and technology that will help South Korean companies innovate. We think that, in fact, the main reason that South Korea was able to make huge economic progress was thanks to science and technology. If you look at the leading industries in Korea right now, in fact, there are things like cell phones, there are things like televisions, they are mostly regarding and relating with science and technology. They're mostly regarding with things that give practical benefits to people's lives. Yes?
What you create under your side of the house is less university courses, less professor space, and less opportunities people have to access that humanities education.
But we think that if the question of happiness is such an inherent question that people have, if it's a question that people cannot live without solving, then we think that people already have the incentive to think about such matters. It's not just centralized education. It's not just a philosophy course that will make you think about those issues. Okay. Now, yes, and we're going to move on to our third argument, which is basically that we think that humanities education is not something that can only be received through formal education, and we think that increasing formal, like humanities education within formal education does not necessarily foster better humanities education. Let's look at what opposition said. They said that the problem with humanities education right now, they gave the example of a history course, for example, is that they don't make you ask fundamental questions, and instead they just make you like blandly memorize. But obviously that isn't something that's going to be fixed just because you fund these humanities courses more. It's the method that's important. If they're saying that the problem is that the humanities courses are asking you to memorize things, but they're not actually asking you to question things, we think that you can change the classes into a more active one, into one where students actively ask about the meaning of life or about how they interpret history and things like that, without the government necessarily having to fund them more in these matters. On the other hand, if you look at STEM, we think that the government actually does need to fund these sort of matters in order for students to keep up to date with the new kind of technology, with the new kind of information. Moreover, we think that because humanities, if students have questions, it's not just only in the classroom that they can answer those questions. We think that in the case of humanities, students and often people who have graduated even often try to find answers to the meaning of their life or about what happiness is through reading books, through discussions with other people, because we think that the idea of humanities itself basically arises from interaction with other people, which is why we don't think that it's always centralized education that it's best to enforce this kind of thinking that centralized education is the best answer. In fact, we think that providing more classes for the humanities or providing like more hours studying the humanities is not necessarily going to bring about the benefits that opposition is saying, because we think that the problem with most centralized education is that it tries to give you an answer, is that it tries to put priorities, but we think that in the case of STEM education, that is not necessarily a bad thing, because when it comes to science and technology, when it comes to mathematics, there usually is some sort of formula, there is some sort of logical reasoning, there is something that people can place a right and wrong to. There are yes or no answers to STEM. But we think that on the other hand, because they gave humanities, because their contextualization of humanities were about things like happiness, because they were about things like value, they were about things like progress, we think these are things that don't have inherent answers in the first place. So we think that it's not necessarily always centralized schooling that can bring about the best answers about these questions, but rather it's by changing the methodology of teaching so that instead of just cramming things into students' heads, to make them question these things more actively, which in itself we don't think requires funding from people. Thank you.
정부 부수상역의 한별 학생은 야당 대표가 말한 인문학의 효용성은 정규 교육 과정 밖에서도 충분히 배울 수 있기 때문에 별도의 투자가 필요치 않다고 반박했습니다. 그러나 이공계 학문은 연구 환경이 조성되지 않으면 지속적으로 탐구하거나 학생의 재능을 발전시키기 어렵기 때문에 정부의 정책이 꼭 필요하다고 주장했습니다. 아까 그 숫기 없던 그 한별 학생이 정말 맞나요? 180도 변한 모습으로 토론장을 뜨겁게 달궈준 한별 학생. 바톤을 이어받아 결승전의 열기를 한껏 더해줄 반대팀의 두 번째 주자는 서울국제학교 11학년 문지원 학생. 토론의 매력에 푹 빠진 지원 학생은 논리력을 발휘하는 일을 미래의 꿈으로 삼고 있다는데요.
저는 커서 변호사가 되고 싶고요. 디베이트를 되게 즐거워해요. 그냥 남의 논리가 펼쳐졌을 때 그게 왜 틀린지 생각해보고 계속 고민해보는 걸 좋아하고.
야당 측 부대표 역을 맡은 지원 학생은 정부의 정책이 시행되었을 때 피해를 받는 사람들이 있는지를 따져보고 그들의 편에 서서 정부 측 부대표의 연설을 반박해야 합니다.
Mr. and Madam Speakers, I personally love mathematics as an individual, and that is STEM. But on the other hand, I have the privilege of standing here today and being able to debate, being able to question, and being able to think in the first place. And that is something that humanities has allowed me to do. And it is extremely unfortunate that proposition only thinks about one side of the coin in today's debate, saying that only mathematics is important, only science will be more important. We believe that they are equally important, ladies and gentlemen. So what is that I'm going to be doing in the Deputy Leader of Opposition speech is very clear. Because we tell you, Mr. and Madam Speakers, that the ultimate burden that proposition had to prove to you in today's debate is why humanities must be deprioritized compared to STEM. That is inevitably something that is going to be happening under their side. Whether it is 45% and 55% or 40% and 60%, what they are inevitably doing is making STEM on top of humanities in the hierarchy. And we believe that is extremely healthy. We believe that they complement each other, and we believe that divorcing this type of marriage is extremely unhealthy when they rely on each other. We believe that they should be equally prioritized in the first place. So, secondly, let's delve into the rebuttals that we actually have for the proposition in today's debate. And I'm going to be dividing this under two levels of analysis. Firstly, STEM. Whether or not STEM is actually more important than humanities, like proposition likes to talk about, or in principle, whether or not STEM and humanities should be equally prioritized. The second field of rebuttal is regarding should the education system or the university education system actually be prioritized to STEM in the first place. The Prime Minister and an extension of the Deputy Prime Minister was this constant line of logic about how STEM gives tangible solutions, about how there was an invention of the Gutenberg press, about things like microchips that actually allowed for more convenience for human beings because it allowed for resources like food or water. But if you don't know how to use it, which is something that humanities provide, what is the point? That is why we say that they need to be equally important. But then, the other line of logic we heard coming from the Prime Minister, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister, was about how this STEM will be a prerequisite for the humanities. We would like to deny this on two levels. Let's consider the Industrial Revolution. It is that people actually questioned whether or not their lives were convenient, and questioned whether or not we can actually be living a more efficient life in the future. That actually pushed these people to devise these industries, to divide more technologies or more efficient machines in the first place. We deny the premise that STEM is a prerequisite for humanities. Rather, we believe that it is vice versa. But secondly, even if that was not the case, we believe that they need to complement each other. Because we tell you that things like the atomic theory, when different scientists build upon each other's ideas, we believe that this is not possible without them debating with each other, without them being able to negotiate each other, which are skills that humanities provide. We believe that there is no advancement in science, there is no advancement in mathematics if people cannot build upon each other's theories in the first place. We believe that these two things are complement. And that is the exact stance that we have brought to you on side opposition today. So fundamentally, we say that moreover, the second benefit that we provided to you was this idea of how we can progress as an economy. Because we told you about the idea of how Steve Jobs would not have been as successful if he did not have the marketing techniques, if he did not add the flavor to his products in the first place. And that is the exact reason why Apple is 92% in terms of competitiveness compared to Samsung. That clearly says something, ladies and gentlemen, because Steve Jobs was a marketer, whereas Bill Gates was only a technician. We believe that actually having a complement is much more effective in terms of boosting the economy as well. Things that were not engaged upon by the Deputy Prime Minister. But moreover, the second level of clash is regarding should the education system actually be prioritized to STEM. And the only line of analysis coming from the Deputy Prime Minister is that this is a matter of funds, that the government actually needs to allocate their funds for things like equipment. But we believe that that is very naive in the first place. We believe that this debate is more than simply a matter of funds. We tell you that in the first level of response, things like theoretical physics, which they conveniently dismissed in today's debate, do not require equipment in the first place. But moreover, we see that this is a zero-sum game, right? So the moment you invest more into things like equipment, that means that the quality of humanities education will be compromised. And we believe that harms their very value of being able to question in the first place. But most importantly, we believe that this is more than a matter of simple funding. We believe that this is also a matter of what the government's stance is, what the government prioritizes in the first place. And the moment that the government sends a message that STEM is more important than humanities, it harms self-actualization, which the Deputy Prime Minister conveniently dismisses by saying they can resort on libraries. We believe that the purpose of education should not only just be about getting a job, like they like to talk about. The purpose of education is self-realization and making citizens happier. That is why it is unjustifiable to emphasize STEM, because people feel happiness when they enjoy the literature, when they find comfort by actually listening to the classical music that they like. But we think that the biggest benefit of humanity education is that it can provide a new experience for youngsters as well. We are more than proud to oppose.
야당 부대표에게 지원 학생은 현재 교육 시스템의 문제는 학생들에게 꼭 필요한 끊임없이 질문하는 능력, 즉 인문학적 소양을 키우지 못하는 데 있다며 이공계 학문에 대한 선별 투자는 인문학 교육의 질을 더 떨어뜨릴 것이라고 주장했습니다. 또한 이공계와 인문계 학문은 상호 보완적이기 때문에 함께 발전해야 한다고 입장을 정리했네요. 야당 측이 전국을 찔렀네요. 이대로 정부 측은 물러서고 마는 걸까요? 당연히 그럴 순 없겠죠. 의리에 죽고 의리에 사는 다음 주자가 팀을 이대로 내버려 두진 않을 겁니다. 찬성팀의 세 번째 주자, 민족사관 고등학교 2학년 성휘연 학생. 토론에 빠진 이유도, 토론을 잘하고 싶은 이유도 모두 한 가지 때문이라고 하는데요.
좋은 친구들인 것 같습니다. 왜냐하면 제가 사실 영어 토론 동아리 하면서도 친구들과 토론을 함께 한다는 것은 서로 생각의 교류도 굉장히 많아야 하고 기본적으로 보내는 시간 자체가 많거든요. 그러면서 좋은 친구들과 좋은 친구 관계를 맺게 되면서 그 친구들이랑 같이 있는 것도 좋고 그리고 함께 토론하는 것도 너무 재미있고 하니까 계속 토론을 하게 되는 것 같아요.
여당 측 원내 총무역을 맡은 휘연 학생은 자신의 팀만 아니라 상대팀의 말까지를 모두 잘 들은 뒤 찬성팀과 반대팀이 가장 충돌하고 있는 부분이 어딘지를 정확히 파악해 찬성 측의 논리를 강화해야 합니다.
I, as all of the students actually standing here on the podium do, had the privilege to go to a school that thought advanced learning in humanities was important. So when I signed up for my ethics class, I was very interested and I was very excited. I thought finally someone is going to tell me how exactly I am going to be happy with my life. And so in our class, we learned difficult texts. We learned Plato's The Republic, we learned Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And in those books, they kept on questioning what is good and what is happiness. But in the end of the day, I realized that all that humanities education, advanced humanities education was giving me was not my key to happiness, but rather what these people have thought about happiness. But we believe that this is very accessible information that can be accessed through the internet. Plato's The Republic, it has been more than over 100 years since it has been open, so yes, you can access it for free. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the information you need for advanced humanities information, the information you need is already there. And today, we are not debating under the motion of what is more important, STEM or humanities, but rather, what does the government have more responsibility in funding, STEM education or humanities education? And underneath this clear stance, we believe we should definitely take this debate home. Now let me go on into the two main clashes I found in today's debate. It's going to be very simple and clear-cut. The first clash is about what does this do to the humanities, and the second clash is about what does it do to the science field. Now let us go on and explain my first clash. What does this do to students about their humanities? Now let me address what the previous speaker has said. He has come up to the podium and expressed concerns that if we do not learn humanities, we are not going to be able to empathize with book characters. We are not going to be able to cry when characters in books die. They also posed a concern saying that how to have a discussion will be a difficult concept to grasp if we do not have high advanced education in the humanities. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not believe this is the case. Rather, because we clearly stated inside our policy, as the first speaker told you, that these children are going to have the basic humanities and ethics education necessary during their elementary school, during their middle school, and it is only when they go to high school and further on when this policy of activating STEM education is enacted, we believe that is why they will basically have the ability to feel empathy for these characters, unlike their concerns. And we believe this is the most important thing when it comes to humanities. Not great professors, not great academic courses, but rather the time and the leisure to think about your life. Because at the end of the day, you are going to have to answer the question about what is your happiness. You're going to have the help of various philosophers, various writers, but at the end, it's going to have to be your thought that answers that. And for that, we believe leisure is crucial. So by actively going behind STEM education, the government is in the long run actively going for the humanities as well. We also believe that this can be further elaborated if you just think of the scenario of a science student wanting to learn humanities versus the opposite case in which a humanities student wants to learn the sciences. We believe that the examples that they gave us about how the humanities should always come first, the Industrial Revolution where Steve Jobs does not count at all. Back in the days of the Industrial Revolution, do you think amazing Yale professors came up to the podium and told people about old philosophers and famous writers, and that was why they were spurred on for the Industrial Revolution? No, they were spurred on because it is man's natural instinct to ask him and herself about philosophical questions, and when you do, you can enact these things without having advanced humanities education, as fancy as that sounds. And also, they gave the example of Steve Jobs. No, Steve Jobs did not listen to fancy courses like Justice. We believe that he was a college dropout that didn't actually care that much about classes in the first place. We believe all of their arguments, all of their examples turn against themselves at the end of the day. So let's go on to our second clash about why we need to increase the budget in STEM education in the first place. And since they brought it up in our POI, let's talk about the pure sciences and pure maths first. Why do we need money in order to endorse the pure sciences and pure maths when you don't need any money to study them in the first place? It's because there are no jobs currently for the people who study pure sciences and pure maths. And you want to create jobs for people in order to incentivize these students to study these things in the first place. Why do students, smart students in South Korea, try to avoid pure science, pure math fields? Is because there are no real jobs allowed for them in the status quo. The government would like to get the money to build jobs for them and to incentivize them to study in these fields. These are students that from a young age learned science, and because they thought they were a little bit better at it than their colleague, they became interested in it and studied more and more, and that was what made the large difference. We believe that the government often does and can influence the interests of these students, and we believe it's not something wrong with something that happens all the time. Thank you.
여당 원내 총무역의 휘연 학생은 야당 측과 가장 대립하는 부분은 정책이 인문학에 미치는 영향과 이공계 학문에 미치는 영향에 대한 입장 차이라고 보았습니다. 그리고 인문학 교육 환경은 현재도 충분히 잘 갖춰져 있지만 이공계는 교육 환경과 일자리가 부족하다는 점을 한 번 더 강조했습니다. 휘연 학생 멋진 실력으로 친구들에게 의리를 입증했네요. 한편 개성 만점의 마지막 주자가 출격 준비를 하고 있는데요. 반대팀의 세 번째 주자 Ytn-한국외대 부설고등학교 2학년 박지윤 학생. 지윤 학생에겐 토론이 남자친구라는데요. 토론이 그렇게 좋아요?
제가 가지고 있는 정치적 성향이 있을 거 아니에요. 그리고 전 좀 이렇게 막 세단 말이에요. 그럼 그 정치적 성향을 반대되는 모션을 제가 받게 됐을 때 거기에 대해 생각을 해봐야 되잖아요. 그러니까 한 번도 생각해 볼 기회가 없어요. 원래 다른 사람들은. 근데 토론을 하면은 그거를 억지로라도 생각을 하게 되니까 좀 더 사람이 둥글둥글해지는 것 같아요. 오히려. 전 디베이트가 참 좋아요.
야당 측 원내 총무역을 맡은 지윤 학생은 앞서 연설한 휘연 학생과 마찬가지로 가장 중요한 대립 지점을 파악하고 왜 야당 측의 논리가 더 좋은지를 설득해야 합니다.
We have two clashes in today's debate. Number one clash is what is the need in the status quo, and secondly is about effect of the policy. So firstly, about the need. They talked about 3 points, Mr. Speaker. Number one, they told you about how humanities does not need any funding, and there is an inherent question that we are able to ask. We have two rebuttals. Number one, if humanities did not need any more resources, then they are going to need more resources under your model because you're going to take resources from humanities and you're going to put that under STEM education. Their prime minister clearly told you about how they're going to guarantee better career paths, how they're going to guarantee better education and better equipment on specifically STEM education. And under the assumption that you are providing better career paths, better abilities to get a job, then we believe that there's going to be a huge influx to that area. We think that that is problematic because now you not only have lack of human resources, you have suboptimal professors that we're going to see from the current status quo. We see this as problematic because we think that fundamentally government budget and government control and the time that students can allocate are fundamentally zero-sum game. So we think that once you start investing on one side of the house, then you are going to have to deprioritize certain sectors. We don't have to risk that in terms of humanities. So secondly, we believe that about that inherent question, we are all able to ask that question, why are we not happy? Mr. Speaker, maybe the government whip was able to ask that question because she was extra smart, because she's in this podium right now. But what we are going to tell you is that public education is not intended for smart students like her, but we believe that it's for mass public. And we don't think that it is necessarily a single person like that asking a single question that is going to lead to advancement and development of our civic society. But we believe that there should be a collective formulation of ideas. We're talking about collective questions that formulate themselves as more people are able to ask that question. And that is catalyzed by things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, that is catalyzed by more humanitarian students asking that question. Secondly, they talked about this funding, about how institution is needed in terms of STEM education. We have 3 rebuttals. Number one, we tell you that they're doing fine. We see that basic maintenance is already being done in the status quo. We see diverse actors having interest on STEM education, such as corporations who actively intervene and try to guarantee more budgets in certain universities that I'm not going to mention the name of. But we see that right now. We think that there are diverse stakeholders who have that, to have the incentive to fund STEM education. We don't have that on humanities. And we think that once government starts to prioritize one thing, it sends out a detrimental social message. And we think that that comes from this motion. But secondly, we tell you that YouTube, okay, they cannot guarantee the best quality. But furthermore, they cannot trigger things like essay and discussions, which our leader of opposition has clearly told you from the start that that is the value of humanity. And YouTube cannot do that, cannot evaluate your essays, cannot make your discussions fruitful by leading that. They can only be done by extensive faculty members. And we think that that can only be done under certain education and curriculums that you guarantee on public education, fundamentally absent under their model. But thirdly, we tell you that that YouTube video is only under the assumption that that student is interested. And we think that public education is where you trigger that interest, where you give an equal chance to to understand that, oh, I have an aptitude on humanities. You're also degrading that by decreasing the hours that you're going to invest on humanities as well. You should give equal chances to humanities prodigies and STEM education prodigies and give them an equal chance in public education. But thirdly, about this social utility, first of all, we tell you that we think that social utility only comes from when humanity calls for it. That was the case of Gutenberg when there was active need for literacy, active need for more information for general public. That was the question that only humanities can raise. But secondly, we already have a plethora of technological gadgets. Why do we need more? We tell you, especially if there's a lack of creativity because there's lack of humanities, Madam Speaker, we see this as a problem. So therefore, we don't think that there is a special need for STEM education. But second clash about effect of this policy. So first of all, the government came up to the podium and told you that because there is no job that are created from pure physics, you're going to fund that. Mr. Speaker, we don't think that that is the issue that can be solved by simply funding that. But secondly, you told us that humanities cannot also get jobs. That is why they cannot put the food on the table. Then, Mr. Speaker, why are you not also funding humanities? Because they're also not getting jobs. That is the fundamental concession that came from government whip, that if you don't have jobs, government should fund that. Humanities, under her logic, is not gaining much support in terms of jobs. So fund them also. Mr. Speaker, government stance is about happiness. And we have seen from our past human history that happiness is not guaranteed from the best equipped technological gadgets. Happiness comes from art. Happiness comes from music, religion, and philosophy. That is why we do not stand for this motion.
야당 원내 총무역의 지윤 학생은 정부 측과 야당 측의 충돌점으로 첫째, 우리에게 가장 필요한 것은 무엇인가? 둘째, 이 정책이 얼마나 효과적인가를 꼽았는데요. 인간에게 가장 필요한 행복이라는 가치는 최신식 설비가 아닌 인문학으로부터 나온다고 논리를 전개했습니다. 한 치 앞도 예측하기 힘든 팽팽한 논리 싸움. 지금까지 나온 야당 측의 입장을 정리해볼까요? 첫째, 이공계 학문을 우선시하는 것은 공공교육의 역할을 저버리는 것이다. 둘째, 사회의 진보와 혁신, 행복의 가치를 배울 수 있는 인문학 교육 또한 장려해야 한다. 따라서 상호 보완적인 관계에 이공계와 인문계 학문은 함께 발전해야 한다. 하지만 이게 끝이 아니라는 것. 야당 대표를 맡았던 재환 학생에게 한 번 더 야당 측 입장을 변론할 수 있는 기회가 주어졌는데요. 시간은 오직 3분. 재환 학생은 야당 측 최종 변론자로서 마지막 기회를 붙잡아 팀을 승리로 이끌 수 있을까요?
Mr. and Madam Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the audience, this debate is very simple because at the end of the day, there's only one question to ask. What do you value in education? How do you prioritize that value? And how do you prioritize it and give up other things along the way? We had happiness on our side of the house and the quest for that. They had benefits, economic benefits that crystallize on their side. But the problem is on our side of the house, you know how to pursue happiness, but the problem of basic necessities, the problem of progress still happens on our side of the house because as we told you from the beginning of the debate, there are plenty of actors who supply those facilities. This debate is about public education, Mr. and Madam Speaker. We will remind you that we're not talking about science prodigies, we're not talking about the forefront of progress. They never prove to you how those prodigies get the benefits on their side of the house, because those benefits, as we told you, already exist. This debate is instead about the masses, the people who face education and begin questioning their life, begin questioning what their future is going to be from that point on. And what proposition never tells you is the fact that the current humanities education in Korea is at a crisis, that the memorization of history turns people away from that history education, that the memorization of ethical terms turns people away from asking those questions about ethics. The government whip tells you that she read advanced Plato in her school. Let me tell you that her school is a private academy. You don't see those things happening in public education. But moreover, she missed the point because they tell you that only basic education is necessary for you to be asking your questions. What we tell you on our side is that the moment you say that basic education is enough is the point where you stop asking those questions. That was the fundamental flaw of side proposition because they just thought this was a problem of funding. They didn't talk about the government message. They didn't talk about the sort of society that changes under their side of the house. They talked about STEM as having an inherent inherent value because it helps the progress of society, because it crystallizes economic benefits. Yet, theoretical physics doesn't bring those benefits, Mr. and Madam Speaker. Theoretical physics is about learning about the splitting of atoms. Those are questions that you ask that aren't actually contributing to the current progress and the current economy that manufactures smartphones, right? But moreover, the final line of problem on their side of the house is that this debate is about public education. You're not talking about people who are prodigies. You're not talking about people who are 100% set on the humanities. You are talking about people who will be asking the question of what does it mean to live as a humanities student or as a sciences student later on. And their policy fundamentally stifles those questions from being asked, fundamentally stifles an educational system that would support those people from asking those questions, and finally a society that recognizes that those questions exist, that unemployed people out there have a valuable life. That's why we're proud to oppose.
야당 최종 변론자역의 재환 학생은 교육을 이윤과 연관시켜 입장을 내세운 정부 측을 비판하며 교육은 행복 추구, 자아 실현과 연관지어 생각해야 한다고 마지막 입장을 정리했습니다. 즉, 인문학적 가치의 중요성을 되짚은 것이죠. 그럼 찬성팀의 입장은 어떠했는지 정리해볼까요? 첫째, 인문학과 달리 이공계 교육은 그 특성상 충분한 환경을 조성하지 않으면 제대로 된 교육을 할 수 없다. 둘째, 이공계 학문은 사회의 실질적인 발전과 직접적인 이윤을 창출한다. 따라서 이공계 학문에 더 많은 투자를 해야 하는 이유와 그 효과가 분명히 존재한다. 야당 측과 마찬가지로 정부 측에도 최종 변론의 기회가 주어졌는데요. 바로 장한별 학생이 맡게 되었습니다. 한별 학생은 야당 측 최종 변론자로서 3분이라는 짧은 시간 안에 심판들과 청중의 마음을 사로잡을 수 있을까요?
Okay, so throughout this speech, I'm going to explain what's going to happen, how the government team is treating the humanities and STEM, opposed to how the opposition team is treating humanities and STEM, and in which system is better education eventually going to be served. Now let's look at the humanities first. Now from the government team, what did we tell you? We told you from the upfront that up to middle school, we are going to provide you with humanities education. We are going to make you read, we are going to teach you history, we are going to teach you philosophy. We told you that we are already going to give basic education. We are going to already give education upon these matters. The problem that we said, though, was that when you go up to a certain level, humanities no longer becomes fruitful just by doing centralized education, just by doing standardized education. In fact, their whole problem seemed to be that humanities in the status quo is about memorization. It's just about stuffing information into your brain. Do you know why that's happening? Government team thinks that's happening because you try to teach humanities through a centralized, standardized system of schooling. Their problem was that, well, humanities isn't encouraged enough, but another big problem they dealt with was the way that it is taught. But we think the big way that it is taught this way, not in a creative way, is because it doesn't address individual needs. Rather, it's trying to be carried out in a centralized system when the questions, in fact, are not ones that actually have concrete answers. And secondly, how is STEM education going to be treated under our system and under their system? Now, opposition team said that there's already enough funding of STEM education. And we told you that that is not true. We told you that high schools do not have enough equipment right now. And because they wanted to make the focus of this debate about public education and not private institutions, we think that this problem becomes even more prevalent. The problem becomes even more serious. Because what public high school that people go to have proper labs other than the basic equipment that you see in the elementary and middle school. We don't think that because the government has to fund so many public schools and because these science equipment are quite costly, there is a necessity if you want to keep students engaged, if you want students to think that science is not something that you just learn from a textbook, science is not just formulas, which is what they wanted to make science and mathematics sounds like. We don't think that science and mathematics is such a boring thing, and that if you treat it in such a boring way, the students aren't going to be as interested. So we think that in order to keep them actively engaged, we told you over and over that you need the kind of appropriate equipment that will interest them. But on the other hand, but in the case of humanities, we told you that there is a smaller need for such equipment. This is not because we disregard the humanities. This is not because we think it's unimportant. In fact, we told you from the very beginning that this isn't a debate about whether humanities or STEM is more important, because in that case, it becomes an obvious op bias, and the op is saying both are important. But we think it's about funding. And we told you from the very beginning, we analyzed to you the characteristics of STEM and humanities. We told you that because STEM actually requires these equipments, while humanities do not. And in fact, centralized education does not seem to be helping the humanities very much. And it also seems to be in line with the problems that they told us ourselves about the issues of how you're only memorizing, of how humanities education is not engaging enough. And for these reasons, we're proud to propose.
정부 측 최종 변론자에게 한별 학생은 이공계와 인문계 학문에서 시급한 문제가 각각 다르다고 주장했습니다. 인문학은 암기만 중요시하는 표준화된 교육 방식을 개선하는 것이 시급한 데 비해 이공계 학문은 실질적인 연구 환경을 조성하는 것이 시급하다는 것이 그 내용입니다. 6명의 실력자들이 보여준 높은 수준의 설전이 마침내 끝이 나고 이제 한숨을 돌리는 학생들.
후련하네요. 이제 대회 엄청 힘들게 했는데 끝나서 되게 시원섭섭한 느낌?
잘했어, 수고했다. 제 스피치에 굉장히 만족을 했기 때문에 사실 결과가 어떻게 나오든 전 굉장히 행복합니다.
넌 우승하고 싶댔잖아.
우승하고 싶어. 우승하면 좋잖아.
우승하면 좋지. 경험을 위해서.
전국 고교생 126명이 참가하고 29개 부문을 시상한 이번 대회 하이라이트.
2015 Ytn Hops Ytn, the 7th Youth English Debating Championship. Very, very close. With 5-4 split decision of 9 adjudicators.
표차는 겨우 5대4.
The champion is Team Papasha.
네, 영광의 트로피는 야당 측을 대변한 파파샤 팀에게 들어갔습니다. 두 팀 모두 힘찬 박수로 서로를 축하하며 시상을 마쳤습니다.
저는 솔직히 결과 듣고 진짜 기절하는 줄 알아서 팀메들 옆에서 잡아줬는데 저는 이렇게 큰 대회 우승하고 나니까 진짜 죽을 것 같았어요. 너무 좋아서.
토론을 더 하고 싶어지고 그리고 이게 좋은 발자국이 될 것 같아서 좋은 경험이었던 것 같아요.
토론 그만하기 싫어요? 되게? 3학년 되고 나서 이제 다른 생각도 많이 해야 되지만 더 그만하기 싫은 그런 느낌.
겨우 한 표 차이로 준우승을 차지한 포더 윈팀. 홀가분한 표정으로 시상대를 내려오는데요.
비록 아깝게 지긴 했지만 되게 배우는 것도 많았고 재밌었어요.
결승 올라왔구나라는 뜻밖의 소식에 막 급하게 준비한다고 좀 부족하지 않았나 생각하고.
저는 사실 뭔가 이 대회에서 계속 뭔가 경쟁자로 만났던 친구들 좀 이제 끝났으니까 뭔가 뒤풀이 같은 걸 해서 좀 사적으로 친해질 기회도 있었으면 좋겠어요. 이렇게 경쟁 관계로만 보지 말고.
다른 사람의 입장에서 생각하고 친구들과 호흡을 맞추며 결과보다는 과정의 즐거움을 배울 수 있었던 2015년 Ytn 청소년 영어 토론대회. 세상을 고민하고 자신을 배워간 오늘. 이곳에서 흘린 아이들의 땀방울이 가슴에는 꽃방울로 다시 피어나길 바랍니다.